Chapter 6. The Circle. On a rocky promontory overlooking the great river of Gren Amar, Ladrin rested at the center of a circle of variously hued dragons. It was as if each one was a richly colored jewel in a giant crown. Icy winds blew over them and churned up the snow around their claws. It dusted the dark red egg that lay before the deep blue of Ladrin. All the dragons were quiet. They had to invoke each other's full presence with silence before they could begin. This ensured the words were not wasted. It ensured that any words spoken did not cause fragmentation in any dragon or their precious world. When the eldest spoke, they all knew the invocation was over. They waited to the sound of erratic gusts of wind and the distant roar of churning water below. At last, a large, deep green dragon shifted his massive, muscular body and spoke. "What is this?" Ladrin heard everything the elder said. These 3 words implored the young dragon to the soul. Sedonai wanted to know why Ladrin had returned with this great mystery. Why, in spite all his teachings, had Ladrin brought something home? And what did he plan to do next? How could he protect the rest of this tribe from the consequences of this intrusion? Ladrin answered with every part of him that had been asked. Honesty was all he could offer his leader now. His spirit shrunk inside his newly grown body. He spoke in low tones. "I don't know." There was a long period of silence again. Every dragon was adjusting around this new knowledge. The world had born something new. They were a tribe of dragons, but now they were a tribe of dragons with something utterly foreign in their midst, something brought forth from the outer realms. Maybe it would change everything. Maybe it would not. Now the elder dragons had seen something they had never seen before, a mysterious red egg in the heart of their sacred home. Sedonai walked slowly over to the lumpy red mass. He brought his great head down close to it and waited. Each dragon was relieved. The simple action of their leader meant he had taken over. The young initiate was not enough for this unexpected arrival. The elder dragon lifted his head and walked to the other side. Again he put his head down close and listened. As there were no Welfram, it could not be stone. The icy winds blew harder, as if to provide comfort and grounding to the uncertain dragons. At last Sedonai spoke. "What is inside is good. What made it is not." Each dragon went deep within. Each one had been trained to wait hours, even days, for a single syllable from their elder's mouth. Now it was as if their great leader had given them a riddle. To ask any more was to admit failure. To speak up with anything but an answer was unthinkable. Sedonai stepped back from the egg. He felt the earnest inner workings of all the council. He had trained them each in how to operate their intelligence, how to dance with its delicate workings. The best had been able to weave their minds with their knowing into one. The least skilled still struggled to differentiate the two. A surge of warmth poured through Sedonai for his fellow elders, his beloved students. He loved their devotion. At last, a pale yellow dragon named Mendian spoke. "It is something free that has been trapped." All the dragons reflexively took a step toward the center of the circle, tightening the jeweled crown. Ladrin, the egg, and Sedonai remained in the center. Ladrin waited. He knew he was too young to participate, but watching the council work together was the greatest reward of his life so far. Every cell of his being was paying attention. Sedonai walked back to the dark red mass and stood. His silence told everyone that he was still waiting. The dragons returned the unspoken declaration with greater searching. After some time, Dalfric, a bright red dragon slightly younger than Sedonai, issued forth. If it is something good, and what has made it is not, then the good must be freed. As Dalfric finished his words, Sedonai quietly and expressionlessly lifted his great claw and found the puncture holes Ladrin had made. He pulled with one sharp talon, and it ran a smooth incision from the top all the way to the ground of the rubbery membrane. Sedonai walked to the other side and repeated the same gesture. The dragons watched their master's every move. Sedonai then walked opposite of Ladrin and nodded. The young dragon clasped one side and pulled as his elder did the same. The membrane draped away, and clumps of a dark, crumbly matter landed on the snow. The strange, scabby material made it hard to see what was inside. Ladrin knew that this was his work to do. Sedonai stepped back and watched him. All the dragons stretched their necks closer as Ladrin scratched and blew on the emerging forms. Little gasps of steam blew up as the heads began to emerge. Every dragon registered that it was something warm-blooded, something not of Gren Amar. It was warm and animal. It was respirating, breathing. All the dragons worked internally, diligently to adjust around the new developments. Something good, something trapped, something alive. Sedonai furrowed his ancient brow. Dragons were the only creatures at the gorge. The other tribes were scattered in remote sanctuaries throughout the continent. Besides the birds and the fish, no creature had ever seen where a dragon lived. If this being became conscious in their midst, it could alter their lives forever. It could upset the balance of Gren Amar. It could bring danger to the ways of the dragons. Ladrin stopped and looked intently at his master. He could feel the collective apprehension, and he was starting to grow heavy with the awareness of what he had done. Perhaps he should have just left this thing to freeze in the snow and come home alone like he was supposed to. Perhaps he should just grab it and drop it in the river now. Sedonai gazed at Ladrin expectantly. "Finish," he said. Ladrin returned to removing the dry, crusty debris. Leathery, curved forms, backs cloaked in thick coats, emerged, and then the two heads were completely uncovered. It was clearly two beings, not one. Their limbs were wrapped around each other. These creatures were unfamiliar to the dragons. Their quests had not yet taken them to the east where humans lived. "There are two," Sedonai announced. "We do not know these creatures, but we know they are good. This is the crust of things held too close. As long as there is any trace of it on them, they are still trapped. By our oaths to all that is free, these two must be cleansed. First by the waters of the lagoon, and then by separation. They will remain unconscious until they are fully clean." The dragons were stunned. Sedonai had never released so many words together. Anything spoken was simply the key to a great mountain of internally ascertained information. But now Sedonai chose to be fully auditory. He had to be specific. Sedonai turned his gaze toward a deep purple dragon named Mara. "You and Ladrin soak them in the lagoon for 2 days. After that, take one to the high grove where Ladrin has been. Take the other to the mouth of the great river. Then come home." Now there was a harder, more immobile silence. Only the violent sound of ice cracking off the cliff was heard. There was a roar as the river received the boulder of frozen water. It was as if Sedonai had issued a death sentence. Of course a dragon could go to the mouth of the great river, though it had never been necessary to do so. But any other creature, known or unknown, could most definitely not survive there. Ladrin shifted uneasily. He knew it was upon him to take one of the creatures to the mouth of the river. This was his doing. Certainly Mara couldn't be responsible for such a journey. He looked around and knew everyone else held the same expectation. Set and I stood still. The dragons waited. 4 hours passed as they all took the edict and adjusted everything they knew around it. When all seemed to have integrated the new knowledge, Mara and Ladrin stepped toward the figures encrusted with the scabs of possession. With a swift jerk, the two sleepy men were yanked apart. Each hung limp and unconscious in the great talons of a dragon. They sailed over the gorge to the mouth of the sea where the lagoon of melted winter songs waited to cleanse them. Chapter 7. Death. The cypress grove was dying. The birds had flown away in terror, and all that could be heard was the crack of desiccated trees. Heavy soot dusted over the gray limbs and charred earth. Trees were falling down one by one rapidly through the sorrowful morning. In the barren field, the 20 priestesses were holding vigil at the great pool of blood. A circle of candles separated the stained earth from the dry, and the smoke of frankincense wafted over the ground. The ashen parents huddled next to each other, trembling and cold. They focused on the prayers of the priestesses as if it might bring their son back. None of them knew what was happening in the ancient stand of cypress. There was a slim hope that their incantations might undo the evil that had been born at this spot, and nobody could afford to spare any attention elsewhere. But the demon they sought to undo was already on the loose. The rage had so completely devoured Janku's flesh that all that was left was the soot of uncontrolled anger. It now surged and roiled through the treetops, killing everything it touched. It had the features of Janku's face as well as his dense muscled torso and arms, but the rest of it faded away in dark wisps that poisoned and ruined and putrefied. Janku was now solidified ash that formed and reformed as it moved, absorbing all light. Having passed through death, its dark power could subdue every thriving thing upon the earth. As the being passed through the trees, sucking the essence from every leaf and limb, it thrilled at the vanquishing of life, and in this way the rage was continuing to feed. Each tree represented nearly 1,000 years of growth and endurance. They were great beings that survived deep changes in climate and geology. The oldest among them had begun their lives near warm mountain pools before the age of earthquakes brought them down close to the sea. Each tree was also the nurturing mother to countless birds, insects, and fur-covered animals. Now all of these among the grove were either gone or dead. Janku the demon had flown deep into the grove and was laying it to waste from the inside to the outside. Its flight of death was cutting closer and closer to the trees rimming the south of the field. It was the mother who noticed the bare patch of sky through the nearby trees. It was she who started to pay attention to the disturbing sounds coming from the grove. The trees, she gasped. A splintering thunder followed as all eyes turned. Just then, Janku the demon rose from behind a cluster of graying cypress. He issued a deafening hiss that burned the ears of everyone in the field. As it took in all the humans below, it scattered in an ominous dark cloud of soot and recollected in the form of Janku. The parents knew him immediately, and the priestesses beheld their worst fear. Everyone inside the circle commanded the seer. The priestesses immediately jumped in and reached out to retrieve the stumbling parents, still reeling at the devastation in their hearts over what had happened to Janku. Tears streamed down their cheeks and they fell over each other just feet beyond the flames of the candles. Start digging. Their prayers could only hold off the demon for so long. To be fully protected, they had to be covered with earth, and as far down in it as possible. The seer took in the great convulsion of women lunging at the ground. "Throw the blood outside," she screamed. Now the circle was a dense storm of motion and flying, blood-stained dirt. Two women finally pulled the parents inside as a hot cloud of soot rushed over them. It burned their skin, but no more. The prayers were holding. The demon rushed at the circle, sending a powerful wind of ash and heat at the priestesses and parents. It cascaded off as if the site were protected by an invisible dome. But the seer knew too well it wouldn't hold long. They had been forced to stop praying collectively, and this meant their protection would soon run out. Sacred words still flowed from the lips of many in the hopes that it would buy them some time. Now everyone was covered in dust. They had managed to throw away the blood-stained earth, making a wide shallow where they crouched together. The demon was a malevolent fury of darkness. The pelting black was all that they could see. Even though they were now lying tightly on the ground, they kept throwing dirt on themselves until the soil was thick over them. Suddenly the noise stopped and the darkness receded. Everyone remained motionless. "He can't see us," whispered the seer. "We're completely covered now." They all watched as the soot recollected into the shape of Janku. The hollow eyes looked down at them, finding nothing. The demon roared, sending clusters of soil dangerously to the ground. But the cover held. They all stared as Janku's attention was diverted away from the circle. He had sniffed his own blood. The seer watched. They had thrown out the blood to protect themselves, but now the demon had found it. What this meant she did not know. The sinister mass leaned close to the ground and growled. "Janku," he hissed. The wisps of soot moved over all the stained clods, and the great dark head darted from side to side. "Janku, Janku," the hissing continued. They all watched the dark eyes quiver. Their eyes blurred as the demon's keen smell found every trace of blood. Flecks of soot fingered the sticky dark soil and swirled around every element. A cold chill ran through the seer as she realized the blood, among its many powers, had the ability to recount the entire story of the bloodline. The demon was remembering the human life of Janku. It was remembering the parents. It remembered the brother. "Thervius," screeched the demon. Everyone inside the circle struggled to contain their terror. With every spasm of fear, the earth rolled off their bodies. Agony seethed within the mind of the seer. The demon had remembered the focus of its rage, and now its sole purpose would be to hunt Thervius down. The demon rose up, and the putrid soot collected back as the sharp-lined Janku. It scanned around and found the roof of the house in the nearby ravine. It moved ominously away, searching for clues, hints, scents of Thervius. Grasses, shrubs, and any other sign of life turned dead and gray as the demon passed. Near the house, the demon quickly found the scent of Thervius, followed it away from the farm to the road, and left the coastal settlement for good. Chapter 8. Waking. Something strange was happening to Belderon. It was something the rugged mountain men had never experienced. And it was insidious, shaking him to the core. As each second passed, he felt he was closer to destruction, nearer to immolation in its unforgiving, relentless presence. It was a force that rivaled and woefully exceeded his own strength. It felt like unrelenting, pure terror. How he would overcome it, he did not know. This was a new enemy. Belderon had survived cougars, flash floods, poisoned nettles, and precipitous trails. He had faced sub-zero nights on open glaciers, found his way through pitch-black volcanic tunnels, and braved the fiercest lightning storms a mountain could summon. But this seemed beyond his measure. He looked into this ominous force and retreated helplessly, though it seemed of no use. He touched his face and in horror felt the wetness on his hands. Belderon was crying. For the first time in his life, Belderon's face was soaked in the sheen of his own tears. It was as if his eyes had liquefied and now were pouring down his face. He could not see. Great shudders passed through his aching body that had already vomited twice. What came out of him was more of the flood. It was water that was as salty as his tears. He was cold, colder than he had ever been. Worse than the chill of this land, he was suffering from the chill of loneliness. The only thing his waking had offered him was the knowledge that he was alone, mercilessly and undoubtedly alone. Thervius was gone. There were no tracks, no sign of him anywhere. Belderon couldn't see any trace of their heart light. He tried to feel inside his heart for Thervius. In the past, even when he couldn't see his beloved, he could always feel him. He could feel the energizing, pristine love of Thervius flowing through. But now he felt nothing. There was no trace of Thervius within or without. All that remained was a sharp-edged image of Thervius in Belderon's mind, reinforced by a deep absence in his heart. The grief struck Belderon with a malicious punch. It was the greatest agony of his life. His beloved was gone, maybe forever. There was no clue as to where he could be. Belderon was helpless, curled up in the snow, sobbing into the frozen ground. Just then a massive icicle dropped and impaled itself in the ground next to him. Belderon froze, then struggled to clear his eyes. With a chilling whoosh, another icicle dropped and nearly stabbed his thigh. Belderon jumped up, disoriented and angry. His distorted vision told him of a shadow to his right and light to the left. He lurched toward the light, stumbling, rolling away from where the icicles were falling. He tumbled into a thick snowbank and stopped. He blinked until he could see the wide meadow rimmed with evergreens. Looking back over his messy trail, he saw that he had been lying under a low overhang to the side of a frozen creek fall. Other than his own swath of disturbed snow, there was no sign of life. The clearing was empty and hauntingly smooth. Belderon stood up and looked down at himself. He was in his coat, fur-lined pants, and boots. They were definitely his familiar belongings, but they were also strange. It was as if they had just been made. The fur was soft and thick, not matted and dusty. The leather was a supple suede that reminded Belderon of the golden color of Thervius' skin. Distracted from his grief, Belderon realized he had plenty to keep him warm, and with the ache of agony fading from his body, he became aware of a physical tingling all over the surface of his skin. It felt refreshed. Belderon took in a few conscious breaths of air and ruminated. He had no idea how he had gotten here and why. For some reason, he was in such good shape. The last thing he remembered was walking on the mountainside through the snowstorm, huddled next to Thervius. Perhaps they had been passed out in exhaustion. Perhaps Thervius had been abducted, though for some reason this seemed hard to believe. The force that brought him to this snowy grove seemed neither malicious nor violent. Had they been saved or discarded? Belderon swirled with questions until he had found something familiar, his love for Thervius. After that came hope. Perhaps Thervius was somewhere unfamiliar too, alive but lost. The thought warmed him and brought him to his deepest intention, to spend the rest of his life with the beautiful man from the south. Belderon looked around. He would look for Thervius. He had no clues as to where to go, but that was less important than the fact that he couldn't stay here. He had to do something. He had to move. After all, he had strength and he had consciousness. He owed it to both of them to try. The mountain man walked in a swift circle, ascertaining the outer rim of the meadow. The trees grew thick all around until his eye fell on a green and blue-flecked boulder. Entranced, Belderon walked toward it and found the embedded traces of turquoise and lapis lazuli. It was like his vision, but so much more. It was beautiful, so beautiful, thought Belderon. He turned around and surveyed the snow-covered meadow again. A shimmering pale blue mist hung in the air. It was exquisite and mysterious. The trees stood high against the orange and red streaked sky of a radiant sunset. Belderon's heart thrilled at the color. He wished Thervius were here to see it. The absence of his beloved invoked his sense of duty. I will take in every detail, willed Belderon, because I am going to find Thervius and tell him about this place. The young man turned, taking in everything. This moment was just for him, and indeed it was, for no human had ever laid eyes on the grove. Belderon was now surging with energy from head to toe. Night was falling, but he was ready to walk. Behind the boulder was an opening in the trees. Belderon stepped in and found himself peering down a long trail of snow orchids growing from a thick vein of granite. He moved slowly forward so as not to disturb the blooms. It was a wonderland. It was more fascinating than a dream. Belderon felt in his heart that if any path would take him to his beloved, this would be it. He moved patiently and steadily among the snow orchids. They were pearly and luminescent. As it grew darker, they glowed more brightly in the dim forest, casting a compassionate light up into the face of Belderon, now thoughtful and relaxed. The sweet light, along with the rhythm of his careful steps, was comforting. As the zenith of the night approached, the orchid path spilled into a thick mountain shelf that was strewn with talus and shrubs. In the bare moonlight, Belderon picked his way through the sculpted path. He came to a great slope and began to climb down huge boulders that seemed to descend indefinitely. The whispers of dawn now glistened on the surface of the rocks. Belderon scrambled over a large chunk of rose quartz and swung his foot down to the next stone. But to his surprise, there was nothing there. Startled, he jumped back up to the next rock and looked down. In this dim light, he saw an opening in the mountain. It was a cave. He altered his descent around the opening and landed on the flat stone of the entrance. There in the dawn light were the furs and sisal mats he and Thervius had left to dry. Belderon rushed forth and buried his face in them. They were a link to his beloved companion. They were something they had shared together. He gathered them up in his arms and hugged them for a very long time. He took a few steps into the cave and realized the water had long drained away. Belderon arranged the furs and sisal mats on the floor and sat down, looking out into the evergreens ahead and the distant mountain peaks behind them. They were stunning, shimmering with pink light of a new day. Although Belderon was still keenly aware of his loneliness, he felt an excitement at having achieved the beginning of his search. And the truth was this place had a beauty that filled his senses. The mountains were persistently silent and remote, but they did not hide their grandeur. And he still had himself. He was not sick or wounded. He had food in the pockets of his coat. His revitalized cloaks and furs pledged warmth. Belderon let out a deep sigh and rubbed his eyes. His body's weariness now matched his emotional exhaustion. He lay down and pulled a fur over him. In half a breath, he was fast asleep.